I'll just say that literally, I'm just coming from Yad Vashem, where I, sort of engage the scholars at Yad Vashem in the conversation, and what is Yad Vashem's role post 10/7? Does Yad Vashem have a role in, the modern mutated mainstream strain of anti-Semitism? What can it be? And at the end of the day, and at the end of all of my engagements, by the way, whether with Jewish institutions and Jewish education or not, whether in university spaces or high school spaces, the key to being able to identify and combat all strains of anti-Semitism, and in particular this strain of anti-Semitism, the mutated modern mainstream strain, if you will, demands or is a moment of reckoning for all educational spaces. I have said that to every university president, chancellor, provost that I have met with, including the 3 university presidents from that Congress hearing who I met with before, and including the committee hearing itself, the education committee itself in Congress, with whom I met the following day and briefed them. So I'll give you a little bit of maybe like a 20-minute framing of the issues, and then we can talk about anything else that I haven't said, if that's okay. First of all, I'm Israel's Special Envoy for Combating Anti-Semitism. I was appointed 3 weeks before 10/7. I will continue referring to October 7th as 10/7 with a very distinct purpose, and I've done so from day one, and that is to say that like 9/11, 10/7 changed the world. The world cannot go back post 10/7 to the world before 10/7. And that has many, many implications, but it's really important, including that it's not just about the Jewish nation state and it's not just about Jews. It's a moment in global history that actually marks what I believe is an existential moment and threat, not just to the Jewish nation state, not just to Jews around the world, but in fact, civilization as we know it. I'll explain and maybe expand a little bit on that. It comes from my own sort of background and probably what brought me into this role. At this particular time, I couldn't have guessed, but my own sort of professional and academic experience actually is from the area of law, international law, more specifically, and human rights. What does that have to do with anti-Semitism? Well, it is actually the co-opting and the weaponization, not just of international law, not just of its mechanisms, ICJ, UNRWA, not just of human rights and social justice. What is happening on campus, including I just came from Stanford, and a student is screaming at me, I can show it to you. Well, first of all, about the police protection. The student was screaming at me, except that the police wouldn't let me get any closer or walk through the front door or leave through the front door. I needed police escort, 10 policemen, me, that would not allow me to walk back out through the front door by the time the demonstration escalated at Stanford, screaming, "We see you. We know that whites call all brown and black people terrorists. We see you, and we will make sure this next generation that this will be the end of Israel and the end of the other terrorist, the United States of America." At Stanford. At Stanford, the chant, which I can show you, "We don't want no Jew state, we want all of 48, makes something very clear. And at Stanford, when the chant is, "There is only one solution," there's a reason for the word solution, intifada, revolution, at Stanford, you can imagine that Jewish students are either putting their head down or at the forefront of the demonstration with Jewish Voices for Peace, having shed the Zionist pound of flesh in order to be a good Jew that doesn't have to be socially excluded for the best years of their lives, which I understand. I don't say that in judgment. And what does international law or human rights have to do with all this? And this is where I'll do a bit of a drill down. And I'll say I come at this from the international law human rights piece. I come at this from my own doctoral research, if you will, about the regulation of speech on university campuses. This is a long time coming. All of this is a long time coming. It's not just, it didn't happen overnight. And I come at this actually from experience as a legislator in Israel's Knesset that engaged for the first time in my own thinking with a social media reality from this perspective, okay? And all 3 fronts, I would say, became much more clear in the intersection, the explosive intersection of 10-7 as part of what I call the unconventional war for public opinion. It has been raging for decades. I have news, usually it's news to my Israeli peers. It was news to my Israeli peers in Knesset. I could only hold hearings about anti-Semitism in Ve'adat Aliyah Klita U'Tfutzot. It should have been held in Chutz V'Bitachon because this is a national security threat, not just to the state of Israel, to the foundations of democracies everywhere. But why is this important and what happened on 10-7 and how does it bring us to education? I'd like to share sort of my analysis from an international law human rights perspective and try and make accessible my understanding of how we got here. The first piece of it is that from 1948 until 1973, in ongoing efforts, wars and between wars, to actually destroy the state of Israel, openly stated by our neighbors, failed attempts, as we know, there was this recognition that the state of Israel, and I'm going to say a mouthful, which I'll repeat a couple of times, the Jewish nation state to which Jews, a prototypical indigenous people, that speak the same language Hebrew, read the same book of the Bible, traverse the same land Israel, practice the same customs and rituals for thousands of years. That's why prototypical indigenous. We forgot that piece. It's important because it was taken away from us, co-opted and weaponized. That prototypical indigenous people returned after millennia of exile and persecution, committed to equality. That mouthful is not me, it's Ben Gurion. In the text of the Declaration of Independence, I recommend to go back and read it and study it. We'll talk about that too. The importance of reclaiming the indigeneity of the Jewish people as a people became all that much more pronounced in and post 10-7. And the understanding that in 1975, I view it as the launch, okay, of the unconventional war for public opinion in none other than the United Nations. With a Zionism is racism, UN resolution, Soviet propaganda, alive and well on every university 2024 campus in the name of progress. We have to recognize it. Zionism is racism, 1975, shmoom, was not shmoom. And by the way, our then Ambassador Herzog knew very well that this is nothing but a piece of paper as he ripped it. The damage that it can potentially do, except that we were consumed with real conventional wars, continued, and threats, conventional threats, continued. And the unconventional war for public opinion that turned Zionism into racism adopted the Soviet propaganda then and became a reality on 2024 campuses, streets, online, in every space that we look at. Fast forward 2021. 2021 for a lawyer was the 2021 Durban Conference Against Racism, especially if you're an international lawyer and delving into human rights. 2021, the 2001. 2021 is too fast forward. 2001, the Durban Conference Against Racism, in none other than Durban, South Africa. And the Durban Conference Against Racism in 2001 turns into an anti-Semitic hate fest. And who is there but NGOs and human rights organizations, some of whom realize that we have missed the boat, that it is human rights that we are so committed to, that it's before it was called social justice in this way, in today's 2024 way, that it is those foundational principles, the international rules-based order, the NGOs, the organizations created to uphold, promote, and protect these foundational principles, and I'm going to say this equally and consistently, not because I'm a lawyer, because selective and discriminate application of any principle, of any rule, actually undermines the principle or the rule or the infrastructure, right? When people say to me, I'm not a lawyer, I don't understand what you mean, I say, well, if you are 3 years old and I said to you, we're going to play a game and you're going to play according to the rules and I'm not, you're the 3-year-old and you will say to me, I'm not playing, that's not fair. Because that's what double standards do. They actually render the piece of paper on which the rule is written completely useless. It doesn't mean anything anymore. The 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism launches us into Israel Apartheid Weeks on every campus across North America and parts of Europe. Israel Apartheid Weeks, no questions asked, no question mark about that. Now, I'm old enough to remember apartheid very well, and Israel is imperfect. But Israel is not an apartheid state, just as Zionism is not racism. We'll talk a little bit about what they are because I think that's part of your mandates in education. But knowing that Israel is not an apartheid state, and now knowing that we have 23 years of graduates of universities that walk through the Quad every single year in order to learn that not only is Zionism racism, who defends racism, Israel is an apartheid state, and there is nothing to do between you and I with an apartheid state but to dismantle it. And I believe that we are now living through the third, perhaps most dangerous Orwellian inversion of fact and of law that actually has co-opted and weaponized the Holocaust itself. Therefore, Holocaust education is not enough. And the word genocide, including South Africa accusing the state of Israel in the International Court of Justice, as if, I mean, literally George Orwell could not have imagined this in 1984, as if the understanding that the convention that we now mark 75 years, the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the word coined by Raphael Lemkin, whose entire family perished in Auschwitz because there was no word to describe the atrocities too terrible to imagine, but not too terrible to have happened. And the coined term genocide turns into a convention, which of course Israel is one of the first countries to join, so that never again to anyone. And the understanding that that convention, as Israel marks 75 years to its miraculous existence and the return of an indigenous people to an ancestral homeland after millennia of exile and persecution, committed to equality, Declaration of Independence, alongside the 75-year anniversary of that convention, that would be co-opted and weaponized against the state of Israel to accuse Israel of genocide, which you have to know the crime of genocide requires one word that is critical, and that is the word intent. Intent to annihilate an entire group or tribe or people. And guess what? That happens even as the state of Israel, and as you've seen, the day has not ended since 10/7. It is a 117-day long day with the devastation and the havoc, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, the atrocities, burning whole families, rape, mutilation, murder, and abduction of thousands on 10/7 by a genocidal terror organization that in its charter, just like Mein Kampf, is committed to the annihilation and murder of the state of Israel and its Jews, and Jews around the world. The understanding that that Orwellian inversion, and by the way, that genocidal terror organization, is but one proxy, let's put it out there, alongside many other proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis, PIJ, many other proxies, of an Islamic regime in Iran that peddles the very same genocidal intent committed to it. And actually, if you have nothing better to do and you're like me, if you follow the supreme leader of Iran on Twitter, you will know that 3 days before 10/7 and since, he regularly calls for the genocide, for the annihilation, for the complete destruction of the Zionist, we'll talk about that in a minute too, the Zionist cancerous entity that is the Jewish nation state. Now, why is anti-Semitism important to all of this? So I say, why international law? In a moment, we'll get to university campuses. But the understanding that co-opting and weaponizing the very infrastructure that was created so that never again to anyone, and never again is a prospect of commitment, never again in the future. We can't prevent the past. The only thing we can do, and as Jews we know, the late Rabbi Sachs said, history is his story. What we have is memory. The understanding of memory of the Holocaust, the memory gives us not just the ability, but the responsibility to identify the current, present, mutated mainstream strain of what we know of as Jew hatred, that Professor Wistrich Zichrono Livracha called the oldest hatred in the world, right? That has actually survived in the thousands of years that we have existed as a people by latching onto the guiding social construct of the time. Religion, science, and then I come into the picture, the secular religion of human rights. the understanding that if you manage to actually latch onto the guiding social construct of the time and through that enable the mutation of anti-Semitism, it's impermeable. It becomes a foolproof way to infect a society. Whatever, and of course, to collapse the guiding social construct. That's where this becomes an issue for everybody, not just for Jews. And we know that where we may be the bloody canary in the mine shaft, ultimately the mine shaft collapses each and every time, right? That what starts with the Jews does not end with the Jews. We understand that. What we have to understand is the mechanism that enables that mutation. And here I come to a very important understanding, and I'm sure that as educators you are familiar with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism and why it is critical, and why post-10/7, not reevaluating the challenges pre-10/7 that people had with the IRA, is really giving us a very, very easy way out that ensures we will not be able to identify and combat this mutated, modern, mainstream strain of anti-Semitism that presented itself not only in the anti-Semitism that fueled the atrocities of 10/7, but in the anti-Semitism that responded to the atrocities of 10/7 in silence. Me too, unless you're a Jew, or we believe you unless you're an Israeli. Silence, the denial. And denial is a key component of history repeating itself that didn't begin decades after the fact, like the denial of the Holocaust that became mainstream decades after the Holocaust. It began even as genocidal, barbaric, savage terrorists were live streaming what they were doing. It's AI, immediately, and the understanding that in that same way of responding, we saw support for, from the river to the sea, from the north to the south, glory to our martyrs. On my first emergency trip to Washington, on George Washington University Library, that's what was projected. Hamas charter, calling for the annihilation of the state of Israel, on the George Washington Library, actually donated by a Jew, of course. So justification, resistance, right? Rape is not resistance. We have to say that. Rape is not resistance. We actually have to say that. But guess what? On campus at Stanford last week, that's what I was being yelled at, right? That it is resistance. That it's resistance to occupation. 10/7 was not resistance. And the worst in the understanding of the same anti-Semitism fueling the atrocities of 10/7 is, of course, the attack of Jews around the world. That devastates me. Not that I have to be escorted by 10 policemen. That devastates me that outside of every school, in every city I visited, there are armed guards. That when I walk into a synagogue anywhere, there are instructions of what to do if there's a live shooter in shul. The understanding that Jewish communities have hunkered down and need additional budget for their safety and security, and they do, and it's critical. In Montreal, where I'm from, fire bombings in elementary schools. In Berlin, houses marked with Magen Davids. And Paul Kessler, please say his name. Paul Kessler was murdered. He was murdered holding an Israeli flag post 10/7. He didn't walk into a megaphone and die. Nobody remembers Paul Kessler. It was in LA. That's insane in the United States of America. A Jew, you want to say killed, say killed, but he was murdered. But he died. Paul Kessler died demonstrating, holding an Israeli flag post 10/7 against the atrocities of 10/7. And here we are in this understanding that the same anti-Semitism that fueled 10/7 is the anti-Semitism that fuels the responses to 10/7, and now we have to name it. And that mutated, mainstream, modern strain of anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. It's the negation of Israel's very right to exist. It's 1948. We don't want no two or Jew state. We want all of 48. It is not about, do you call it Judea and Samaria or the West Bank? That's not what 10/7 was. 10/7 murdered 72-year-old Canadian Israeli Vivian Silver, whose remains it took 5 weeks to identify. Peace activists. In where it is clear that it has nothing to do with 1967. It's 1948. And so we go back to the importance of a definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. Remember, I mentioned the 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism. Well, in addition to the Israel Apartheid Weeks that began to sprout up on every single campus, a group of scholars gathered and began what we know of as creating the definition. A definition that is the result of a very long democratic process that has been adopted by more than 40 countries and over 1,200 entities, that it is the only definition that exists. And I know that the White House strategy embraced alongside the IRA, the nexus, which is actually like saying absolutely nothing, because they actually contradict one another. And if you don't use the IRA, you're not going to be able to identify anti-Semitism. Today's mutated mainstream strain, and here's the great news for me post-COVID, is now I can explain to everybody that when viruses mutate, the old strains, they don't die, they just mutate, they still exist. But if we don't inoculate our populations, our campus, our societies, our spaces against the new strain, you better believe it's going to infect our population, our society, our campus, our space. And the new strain of anti-Semitism has to be identified forcefully, comprehensively, alongside the old strains, because they're still there. Holocaust denial still there, and blaming the individual Jew for what Israel does still there. And the Jews controlling the media is still there. That's all still there. That's why the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, when you study the Holocaust, is a critical piece of studying the Holocaust. The Holocaust didn't just happen overnight, and I have news for all of us. Genocide, that word that we should shudder when we speak, it doesn't just happen to us. Genocide has happened in Rwanda, in Bosnia, right now in Darfur, even as South Africans' leaders welcomed the leader that is perpetrating the genocide in Darfur right now. And the key to understanding what it is that enables genocide is part and parcel of the IRA working definition. And it is the dehumanization, the delegitimization, and the double standards, Natan Sharansky's 3 Ds, that are a critical part of IRA and don't exist in the alternate definitions that people say, well, there's all kinds of definitions. Maybe there are all kinds of definitions, except they don't identify that part. The 3 Ds, which made themselves very clear, not only in what enabled the atrocities of the Holocaust, the dehumanization, think about it, that is not a human baby, you can rip off the poster of a hostage baby, 10 months old, now a year old in the hell of Gaza, because that's not a human baby, dehumanization. The delegitimization, the individual Jew does not have a right to exist. Well, neither does the Jewish nation state, the proverbial Jew among the nations. And that's what we are, just one Jew in a whole family of nations. We were supposed to be equal. And the double standard, consistently and constantly applied to the state of Israel. In all of those international institutions that we so believed in and created to uphold, promote, and protect the international rules-based order, providing it does so equally and consistently. But guess what? The Human Rights Council, it has an agenda item singularly for Israel every single year. And guess what? It turns out that there are more human rights violations according to that agenda item perpetrated by Israel every single year than all the human rights violating countries in the world, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, China, all of them. That has happened over decades in the international institutions. Now we know to speak about UNRWA, but it's been 20 years in coming. What we see now, 12 teachers, 3,000 teachers. For 20 years, there's been evidence that UNRWA, basically, I'll say this, UNRWA was born in sin. Because remember I said double standards, they undermine an entire infrastructure? The other flip of the double standards towards Israel is the double standards for the Palestinians. There's no other group of refugees that has their own agency to speak of and help for forever, in perpetuity. I am the granddaughter of a refugee, alongside 850,000 Jews that were refugees from Arab lands in Iran, my Saba from Iraq. One generation, like all other refugees ever around the world. But no. And if any of you are interested in this, there's a book by Einat Wilf called The War of Return. It's very important to understand that UNRWA, born in sin, essentially disenabled the possibility of us reaching some sort of coexistence with the Palestinians. We could talk about that another day, although it's important to understand. I'll get back to, because I want to be able to drill down into your questions, I'll get back to my train of thought. The last piece, or the last front, I mentioned the international law front. I mentioned the university front, Israel Apartheid Weeks on every single university. On the university front, there are other intersecting processes, especially in the United States, maybe also in other places of the world a little less. What we know of now is the DEI infrastructure. When I began my research on the regulation of speech, or speech codes, began with safe spaces and trigger warnings and microaggressions. I was just wondering what a microaggression is. That's why I started my doctoral research. I was like, how are you going to measure that? Like, what's 1/1000th of an aggression? What does that equal, like in law? Are you going to sue for a 1/1000th of an aggression? So I began that understanding. And all of a sudden, what became clear is that the regulation of speech only applied to some people. That's my problem. I'm a single standard girl. There is this DEI infrastructure. We can talk about that too. Americans are going to have to talk about it. They're starting to talk about it post 10/7, because D, diversity, I'm all for it. E, equality. Oops, it's equity. How did that happen? Equality and equity are not the same thing. Equity, by the way, is sort of communism. It measures results, no meritocracy, and not opportunity, right? Which is what equality was, what America stands for. Conversation is going to have to be had in America. And diversity. Well, as long as inclusion and diversity are applied equally to me too, I'm really good with the DEI infrastructure. But I insist that the DEI infrastructure, and this is what I say to every university president, be applied equally and consistently to all. To David, who happens to be a Jew, to Sally, who happens to self-define as a Zionist, and to Fred, who just thinks Israel has a right to exist and doesn't know much about the issue. But DEI applied selectively, that leaves out or excludes, it's the opposite of inclusion, it's exclusion, it's the opposite of diversity. It is not at all diversity, because it says to David and Sally and Fred, but not you. But not you. And the reason it's able to do that is precisely because of the Zionism is Racism Resolution 1975. Who defends a racist? If Zionist, and this is back to you as educators, is not reclaimed as an identity, when I speak to university presidents, including the one in Stanford, and say, I am a Zionist, I can't just shed my Zionist pound of flesh. I belong to that prototypical indigenous people, which you've taken away from me because you tell me that Israel exists because the Holocaust occurred, when it's precisely the opposite. The Holocaust could not have occurred had Israel existed. How do I know? 10/7. We would have at least defended ourselves if we needed a poignant reminder. But the understanding that you've denied my identity as a member of an indigenous people, and you make me into a white person. I am not white. I told you where my grandfather is from. I'm a member of a prototypical indigenous people. And the entire division of the world between oppressed and oppressor, victim and victimizer, it doesn't apply to my story. That's not who my people is. Maybe it applies to your story. I don't know. I'm not going to speak for you. It's not my story. And you have kids that go through 12 years of Jewish education. And when I say to them, I am a member of a prototypical indigenous people. If they're Canadian and Australian, they say, you can't say that. And I say, no, I can. Not only can I say it, I can prove it to you. What does indigenous mean? And we go through what indigenous means. And I say, look, I'm a member of a people. Speaks the same language, Hebrew, reads the same book, the Bible, traverses the land, practices the same customs and rituals for thousands of years. That's what indigeneity means. But I am also a Zionist, because my ancestors, they prayed and yearned and longed to return to Zion. And guess what? Zionism, a progressive national liberation movement whose only fault is that it succeeded, enabled me to do exactly that as a prototypical indigenous people. But I remain a Zionist because it's an integral part of my identity. Invariably, there's a Jew in the audience or demonstrating against me that says, this actually broke my heart and actually made me cry as I was entering NYU. It was before I was in this role, and I was on a law school tour because that's what I know how to speak about, international law and human rights, combating anti-Semitism with international law and human rights. All of the demonstrations against me at NYU, at Rutgers, at Columbia, at Yale, at CUNY, I couldn't even speak. I just met with students in a back room. All of the demonstrations against my talk on anti-Semitism was anti-Zionism. So I don't have to prove the IRA. I can basically put my speech down and say, just look at the demonstrators. I came to talk about anti-Semitism. The response is anti-Zionism. You add up the dots. Anti-Zionism is the new mutated modern mainstream strain of anti-Semitism. Thank you to the demonstrators. And now we'll talk about what just happened. Because at the entrance to the law school at NYU, in big pink chalk letters, it says, Zionists not welcome. but Zionist just replaces Jew. And for a 20-year-old student to cross the threshold and enter the law school, it takes courage, because nobody wants to be socially excluded at 20. They just want to go to the party, for crying out loud. And I have students saying to me, I decided to come out. And I say, come out as a Zionist. I decided to come out as a Zionist. And they're courageous when they decide to come out as a Zionist, because they know that they're about to lose their friends. And they have since 10/7, if they've come out as a Zionist. If they weren't before ready. And they don't even understand, because some of them didn't come out as Zionists. They just say, no, I have a cousin in Israel. Oh, your cousin's a genocidal baby killer. No friends, gone. That's the campus space. We can talk a little bit more about the DEI after. I think it's very important to be able to equip, because in all the educational spaces, certainly in public schools and so forth, it's very important to demand that whatever infrastructure exists, we can talk about it, do we love it, do we not love it, but if it exists, it has to apply equally and consistently, so long as we reclaim Zionist as an identity. And by the way, you all know that everybody gets to self-define as whatever they want in today's world. It cannot be that everybody gets to self-define except for me, the Zionist. It cannot be. That's unacceptable, because I'm a single standard girl, and double standards undermine the entire infrastructure, including all those that hope that the DEI infrastructure will protect them and their identities. And finally, I'll say 2 words about the social media space. I think, well, you can tell me more about the challenges of teaching in today's world with the perspective or understanding that the way that humanity consumes information has changed. Just like with the advent of the print press. It has changed. Maybe we haven't changed, but the way that we, even us, consume information has changed. And part of the reason that when I was in Knesset, I engaged other legislators from around the world and formed an interparliamentary task force to combat online anti-Semitism, is that social media platforms actually have a global effect. It's not regional. It's not what happens in Israel, what happens in Germany, what happens in the United States. For them, it's very convenient, by the way, when we engage them one region at a time and one geography at a time. But that's not reality. There's a global reach to the social media platforms, and what happens online does not remain online. What happens online has very real world harm, very real world manifestations. Everywhere we look, Pittsburgh, the Boston Mapping Project, over and over again. COVID, that's why I started the Interparliamentary Task Force to Combat Anti-Semitism. Online anti-Semitism. It was with legislators from the United States and Canada and Australia and the UK, and other legislators joined us. And we created this holding to account mechanism that would be global. We held hearings. After the hearings I held in Knesset, in Congress, then we held hearings in the European Parliament. And I'll say that I, as a special envoy for combating anti-Semitism, am one of about 30 special envoys for combating anti-Semitism around the world. Deborah Lipstadt in the United States, Deborah Lyons in Canada, Katharina von Schnurba in the European Parliament, and many, many more. 30 special envoys for combating anti-Semitism. That's devastating news. That means that way before 10/7, there was this constant increase demanding that there be a special role of a special envoy for combating anti-Semitism. Post 10/7, the tsunami of anti-Semitism that can only be described as that has actually resulted in hundreds of percentage of rise. And we know that, by the way, there's an under-reporting of anti-Semitic events and under-identification, because if you don't use the IRA, you don't recognize all strains of anti-Semitism. And I'll say the social media piece is critical in the same way for us to acknowledge engaging with the very same tools, and I will go back to what the tools are, and then we can drill down on whatever interests you. The IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Please, if you haven't read it, please do. Not just what's in the neat little box, but all of the examples. The reason that that is important, and I say to people all the time, why is it a working definition? It's not even legally binding. When university presidents say to me, but it's, it's gonna, free speech, and it's not legally binding. You can't throw someone in jail because they've violated the IRA. The only thing you can do with it is utilize it as a resource that it was intended to be. Because when you say, I want to combat anti-Semitism, you have to be able to identify it. To be able to identify it, you have to define it first. That's the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. It has to be part and parcel of Holocaust education. Because when we teach never again, the role is not just to remember the past. It's to understand its present manifestations in order to prevent the recurrence of atrocities right? That's what never again means. And IRA is a key instrument to be able to teach that. So when I go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and I say, never mind, do you teach the IRA? Have you adopted the IRA? And the answer is no. Then we're doing something really wrong because we're just in the past. We're just in the past and we can't prevent the past. And the second piece of it is, of course, reclaiming the story of this country. That is the miraculous 75-year young nation state of a prototypical indigenous people to which we returned after millennia of exile and persecution, committed to equality, Declaration of Independence. It's an incredible resource. It exists precisely for that reason, in order to be able to begin to drill down what that means, but also in order to be able to respond and say, oh, wait a minute, that white colonialist European thing, that's not my story. It's not my story at all. That you can't throw that on me. I mean, maybe it's your story. It's not my story. I'm a member of small people, 16 million of us. And I understand that that whole division of the world between oppressed oppressor has its own challenges. We're going to have to deal with it. But it's not my story, that's for sure. And I'm going to extract myself from this story because identity, and I have to say, this generation is so in tune with the word identity. So when I share or impart knowledge, they say, but that's too much information and I don't know all that and I haven't read all that history. But when you share it through that word identity, then everybody has their rightful identity in this generation. They're very busy with their identities in all kinds of ways. Well, you're going to be able to engage through that understanding of identity in that. And the last piece, of course, to that is Zionist. Zionist is not a political statement. That doesn't mean all Jews are Zionists, by the way, and they get to self-define as however they self-define. I'm not going to tell them how to self-define. And when that student, that Jewish student that wants to make me cry, when I entered the law school, I forgot to tell you that story, looks at me, always with a COVID mask, by the way, the demonstrators are always wearing masks, now I know, looks at me with gorgeous eyes, it's all I see because the rest is covered with masks, could be my son, and says to me, gives me a pamphlet, accusing me of being a genocidal, racist, white colonialist, everything you can imagine, baby, ethnic cleanser, on the entire map of Israel, and gives me the pamphlet about myself. And I say, you know, you should come into my talk. I'm going to address some of these points, third year law school. I'm going to address some of these points. And he says, I'm Jewish. I would never come into your talk. I hate Israel, and I wish it would disappear. Is the only time that I've ever been actually so rattled that I walked into the law school and Penelope, the director of students, looked at me and said, do you need a minute? And I said to her, yeah, I actually do. And I went into another space before going into the auditorium. Because the understanding that this kid actually thinks that all of his problems will be solved if Israel will just disappear, 75 years after the miraculous return, miraculous, of an indigenous people to an ancestral homeland after thousands of years of exile and persecution. That is heartbreaking beyond anything you can imagine. And when at the very same time at NYU, same university, after the demonstration in which it's disrupted and 50 people get up and walk out, and I'm like, oh, 200 people didn't come hear me today. After that, and they go into a teach-in that is actually called the institutional, who knows, woke. Institutional, next word. So usually it's institutional racism of NYU, and that's what the talk is supposed to be about, but that's not what it says. It says the institutional Zionism of NYU, because Zionism replaces racism. So the institutional Zionism of NYU means that to the students attending the teach-in at the same time as I'm talking about anti-Semitism after they've been escorted out of my talk, which they disrupt. Full circle back to where we are post 10/7 and the opportunities that I think not only do we have, but the responsibility that comes with them. So many masks were brutally ripped off, not only on 10/7, but as I said, in the responses to 10/7. And we cannot ignore, not even for a moment, what that means for our engagement with the outside world, the international institutions. You're welcome to look it up. I spoke at the UN precisely about this. You saw UNRWA. You see what's happening at the ICJ. You've seen all that. What happens on university campuses, engaging the university presidents to adopt IRA, to add Zionist as their a protected characteristic, protected identity, which they have in all of their DEI infrastructure, to train DEI officers in the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Because when you get a complaint about anti-Semitism, how are you going to know if it is or it isn't if you don't have a definition? And with the online spaces, to not only demand transparency of algorithm and policy and implementation, but that they too use the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism and add Zionist as a protected characteristic, because they too actually have codes of conduct that you cannot violate. If you're a protected characteristic, you can't just say whatever you want about everybody online. That's the news. There isn't really free speech, not to mention that it's not really a free speech model. It's not free at all. It's very expensive. Somebody's making a lot of money off the polarization of social media platforms and the current business model. And that's already a legislative need, but also an educational component of teaching our kids and ourselves how we consume information there. But the understanding that when we turn the lens inwards, it's a moment of reckoning for our educational spaces. All of them. And they are wonderful. And I was educated in them and my children were educated in them. But in many ways, the co-opting and weaponization of our story and of our identity, and maybe it even served a certain purpose. We could talk about that for the Americans in the room, for others in the room, right? In order to receive protection in the United States of America, what we were was a religion, right? In order to be protected like all other religions in the United States of America. But we, as that prototypical Indigenous people, we're not just a religion, we have a religion. And we're not just a culture, we have a culture. We're not just a country, we have a country. We are a people. And the understanding that I am looking at the change agents that have this moment of reckoning, that renegotiate what it is that we teach throughout the ages, and I would say the younger the better, because university is very late in the game. Very, very late in the game. It is this critical moment, and it's an amazing moment. I'll say one last thing and open it up. It's an amazing moment for us as a people. It's an amazing moment that actually, in many ways, I think enables us for the first time in our history, because 2024 is not 1944. We have sovereignty, we have a country, we have an IDF, with half of us living in this country, and the other half living in the rest of the world with relative, maybe a little more uncomfortable, but relative safety and security and rights. And that means that if we are all boots on the ground in the way that our kids, I own 3 kids, are in the army, so I have to share with you that we have buried more of our friends' kids and our kids' friends than we've even begun to process since 10/7. Not just on that day, but since that day. They are boots on the ground, and we are boots on the ground, that's true. But there's another half of our people. The other half of our people are also boots on the ground in the unconventional war for public opinion that I tried to describe, that has been raging for decades, and that we have, the first time in our history, the ability to stand proud and say, you know what, no. No. And reclaiming identity, and reclaiming our story, and reclaiming, I'll say, the courage that it requires. And the late Rabbi Sachs differentiated between optimism and hope. He said that optimism is the belief that everything will be okay for the Israelis, yeh beseder. But hope is the belief that together we can make it okay. So in that sense, optimism is a very passive virtue, whereas hope is a very active virtue. And it takes not very much courage to be an optimist, but a great deal of courage to have hope. And I remind us that our national anthem is a tikva, and that hope actually kept our people for thousands of years. This is going to sound awful, but in much more difficult situations than we are in today. We've never had it so good when we have it so bad. We have to be honest, and we have to speak with moral clarity and with courage, and understand that our kids are not babies, and they're not fragile, and they are resilient. We just have to equip them with tools to be able to identify and combat what they are facing in the spaces and placing. And believe me, they are so capable. They are so smart. And they are so actually lost in this moment of time that I think it's up to, in the hearing that I spoke at the UN, one of the students said, where are the adults in the room? Where are the university presidents and administrators and parents and UN officials, and we can keep the list going? Where are the adults? And we're the adults in the room. And this is basically the call for our generation at this critical existential moment. I'm not denying it. It is an existential moment. I go back to where I began. The Jewish nation state, for the Jewish people around the world, and for the foundations of democracies or shared foundational principles of life and of liberty. But who are we not to try, right? In this moment of challenge and opportunity. And we're about to, mark Purim, and I just said to my peer, to my colleague, Deborah Lipstadt, she's a special envoy for combating anti-Semitism for the United States, you should know that her mandate does not include the United States. She's appointed by the State Department, for the Americans in the room. She's appointed by the State Department, therefore her mandate is everywhere outside of the United States. Something that people don't often know. But I reminded her exactly what it is. That first time, this is where memory comes in handy, that first time when ancient Persia wanted to commit genocide against the Jewish people because we were spread out and it seemed like an easy thing to do. Imagine that, look at this. After Mordechai says to Esther, maybe it's for this moment in Lo La'at Hazot, and after she says, Knosset Kol HaYudim, and he does, he says to her, אם חרש תחרישי בעת הזו, רווח והצלה יעמוד ליהודים במקום אחר, ואת ובתווך תובילו, right? If you'll be silent at this moment, then salvation will come to the Jewish people, and you and your father's house will disappear. But the importance of understanding that that's our story. And this is the moment of our generation with moral clarity and with courage and education, and I'm looking at the key, is actually the most important front on which we can not only reclaim and identify and combat anti-Semitism, but from a positive sense in this historic first, not only as Rabbi Soloveitchik spoke about the covenant of fate, always throughout our history, reminding us that we're actually one people, but the idea of the covenant of destiny. I think that this might be the first generation that actually has the wherewithal and the bandwidth to even consider what that means, opting in to our shared identity and not being forced at it from the outside, singularly by anti-Semitism. I mean, we got a little nudge. But that is, I think, the call to action of our generation. I'm going to stop right here and we can move to questions. And we have until...
You've got like 10 minutes.
How long? 20 minutes? I'm sorry, I spoke for a long time. Nobody went like this. Quoted President Herzog. Or the quote of Amalek, and doesn't even have the information of what Amalek is. And Amalek is not a people, by the way. Amalek are those that zimvu b'nechshalim, right? In the back, it's precisely what Hamas did, right? They burned entire families with their babies, and they raped women, and they abducted Holocaust survivors. And I have the right to use my referencing, but that's not my point. Not at all. Although the case that Israel made in the ICJ is very important to watch as an educational moment. If you have high school kids, you need to watch that. It's a 3-hour, incredible moment of Israel rising from the docket of the accused. Where Dreyfus sat, Israel has sat for many, many decades. And what's my point? My point is that if we're going to evaluate what President Obama said while fighting ISIS, we can compare it to what President Herzog said. I'm good with that. Meaning, when those 3 university presidents could not tell us if it's a violation of their code of conduct to call for the genocide of Jews, what I would have asked is not that, because free speech says maybe it does depend on context. By the way, according to the First Amendment, it does. It depends on context. But the context was the 10/7 massacre and the calling for the genocide against any other group on their campus would be a violation of their code of conduct. That's just good old double standards, and I'm a single standard girl. You can't even misgender somebody on university campus today without violating the code of conduct. You certainly can't call for the genocide of anybody else. And what I want to say about that is there are plenty of idiotic politicians all around the world. In fact, one may get elected in the United States of America for president again. There, I said it. So what? The criticism of the state of Israel and the IRA clearly stipulates that, and I may disagree or agree with these politicians and with those politicians, and I may even vote for idiotic politicians because there aren't that many good politicians for me to vote for, which may happen again all over the place. But that's not the point. The point is that the criticism of the state of Israel, like the criticism of any other country, is not anti-Semitism. IRA clearly stipulates that. What is anti-Semitism is the delegitimization of Israel's very right to exist. There's no other country in the world whose very right is called into question. Not Cuba, not Venezuela, not the United States, not Canada, not France, not Iran, not any, not China, none. And that is something that we have to be very clear on, meaning when we enter into the political realm of Israel, and by the way, I've been told that I shouldn't enter into the political realm of the United States of America, specifically by talking about the DEI infrastructure and say what I said here, which is that equality is not the same as equity. I've been told that by Americans. That's not your business. And then I asked, did you have an opinion whether the judicial reform or revolution was a reform or a revolution? They said, yeah. And I said, you really shouldn't enter that. Because the truth is you don't understand the nuance. Now, I may think I understand the nuance of DEI because I wrote a doctoral thesis on it, but it doesn't matter. It's legitimate to say there are political realities, and I mean, I'm happy to delve into that, but we don't have the time, of how we got to where we got to politically. By the way, I think social media spaces have a lot to do with it in the polarization and fragmentization of our societies, but also keep in mind that when you look to one direction and you say, well, I'm going to look this way, that's very extreme. You have to look at the other direction and say, wow, that has been here for a while, including members of Knesset that call Israel an apartheid state and accuse my kids of being Nazis because 3 of them are in the army. So what did we think when we took the free speech model to the nth degree? Did we not think that there was going to be an extreme on the other side? And because I'm somewhere in the middle as a moderate, I say, well, if there are rules that apply consistently and equally that say that is not okay in my democracy because it undermines or threatens or supports terror, true story, then I'll be able to say, you know what, that's not okay either. But I can't have it both ways. I can't look here and say, I hate that, but that's okay. And that is like, if I went into the nuance of things, that's true everywhere, by the way, and I think in our democracies that are challenged very much in this polarizing time, again, the algorithm in which we are mirroring in our societies the polarization instead of the majority muscular moderates saying, enough, enough. We are not going to be dictated by these polarities that represent, fringe ideas or are voted for because there are no other options. Whole other story. Because I ran in 3 of the 5 elections, I could share that on another day. But the understanding that nothing ever justifies anti-Semitism. Ever. If you would tell me, statistically many more Black men are in prison because of much more crime, therefore I'm a racist, in what world would we think that that would be okay? The opposite. We would say, I wonder why. There must be something that maybe prevents or there's equal opportunity and so on and so on. That's how we got to DEI, right? In many ways, rightly. But to be able to say there are people who say certain things, therefore anti-Semitism, therefore the delegitimization of Israel's very right to exist, therefore the dehumanization of Jews around the world, therefore the double standards applied that just morphed. Double standards, those 3 Ds, they encapsulate so well what we have to understand, because you say this, the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards that used to bar, or still bar, the individual Jew from an equal place in society, they just morphed to the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standard of the proverbial Jew among the nations, preventing it from equal place in the family of nations, in the society of nations. Now, the moment that we understand that is the mechanism, that doesn't mean there's no idiots or no bigots in our society. Since when did we ever say that? And I am the last person that will tell you that Israel is done and is perfect. We have so much to fix. That is not the same as those 3 Ds, demonizing, delegitimizing, and applying double standards to. And that's why it's easy for me, because in many ways, in order to be able to identify and combat anti-Semitism, the first thing that we have to know is that politicizing it actually enables it. For the alt-right, Jews will not replace us. I'm never going to be white enough. And guess what? For the radical left, I am super white. That is precisely how the virus of Jew hatred works, right? For both being a communist and a capitalist. For both what we are and what we aren't. And so the clarity of identifying and combating anti-Semitism, it doesn't get you into a challenge in discussing the nuance of politics, if you will, and the nuance of understanding. And it's very important to understand the nuance of democratic evolution or development, but it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism, and it never justifies it, in my mind at the very least. And politicizing it, for me, is actually enabling it to thrive.